Israel has faced a barrage of cruise missiles and drones in recent weeks, but not from Hamas in Gaza or the Houthi rebels in Yemen or Lebanon's Hezbollah. The attacks have been launched by Iraqi Shi'ite armed groups such as Islamic Resistance operating hundreds of miles away from Israeli borders. This is the kind of direct conflict between Israel and other Middle Eastern powers that the world had long feared would mark the explosion of a full-blown regional war. Though the attacks have not drawn blood yet and are not seen by Western officials and Israeli experts as posing a grave or existential threat to Tel Aviv, what sets off alarm bells is the increasing frequency of such attacks. At least 2 aerial attacks, claimed by the Islamic Resistance, hit their targets in Israel's Red Sea port of Eilat in April this year. Many drones and missiles have had to be shot down by US and Israeli defenses, according to public statements by US officials and the Israeli military. While drones are easier to intercept, cruise missiles, which have been regularly used since May, are reportedly harder for air defenses to destroy. According to Mike Knights, a fellow at the US-based Washington Institute for Near East Policy, the intensity and the types of weapons systems used have steeply escalated. It complicates the Israeli task and is an increased financial cost. Sources in Iraqi armed groups and other factions in an Iran-backed network of regional allies known as the Axis of Resistance, as well as US and other regional officials, say that the attacks by Iraqi factions, including Kataib Hezbollah and Nujaba, were a cause for rising concern for Israel's closest ally Washington. The strikes have also caused unease among some in Tehran and its ally Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has exercised restraint in its attacks on Israel to prevent an all-out war which can engulf the entire region. A senior figure in the Axis of Resistance said, "They could get the Axis involved in something it doesn't currently want." Iran and Hezbollah, the most organized members of the network, have in the past struggled to rein in Iraqi factions which are trying to rise to prominence amid the war in Gaza, much like their Yemeni allies the Houthis. According to Hussein al-Musawi, a spokesperson for Nujaba, one of the main armed Shi'ite factions in Iraq participating in strikes on Israel, the strikes were a natural evolution of the role of Iraqi groups and aimed to increase the cost of the war in Gaza. They intend to strike from anywhere, for as long as is necessary. Al-Musawi told Reuters, "The operations carried out by the resistance are not bound by temporal or spatial boundaries. We, as a resistance, do not fear the consequences as long as we are in the right, and we represent the popular and official will." While Iran has been keen to have Iraqi factions contribute to the regional battle against Israel, their propensity to miscalculate was a constant cause for concern in Tehran, the senior Axis figure told Reuters. The killing of 3 US troops in a drone attack on an American outpost in Jordan in January by the Iraqi groups crossed multiple US and regional red lines. This triggered a deadly campaign of US airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. So serious was the risk of escalation then, that the commander of Iran's elite Quds force reportedly traveled to Baghdad to tell the factions to dial down their attacks. Following criticism, the attacks on US forces stopped and there was a brief lull. Then, they turned their attention to Israel. The Iraqi groups trace their roots to the fight against US troops in Iraq after the toppling of controversial leader Saddam Hussein in 2003 and the subsequent build-up of military bases in the country. The Iraqi government, which carefully balances its alliances with both Washington and Tehran, does not officially approve of the strikes but has been unable or unwilling to stop them. On April 16th, al-Sudani said his government had not received any reports or indications that missiles or drones were launched from Iraq during Iran's attack on Israel on April 13th in response to Tel Aviv's strike on the Tehran embassy in Syria a month before. Experts say this shows the limits of Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani's power in a coalition government that includes Iran-backed armed groups and may undermine efforts to rebrand Iraq as stable and open for business. Iraq doesn't recognize Israel, and a 2022 law punishes those trying to normalize ties with death or life in prison. Meanwhile, Israel views Iraq as an Iranian vassal state and the main corridor for weapons from Iran to other armed groups including Hezbollah. Iraq had posed a threat to Israel before, notoriously during the 1991 Gulf War, when Saddam fired barrages of Scud missiles at Tel Aviv and Haifa. After Hamas fighters launched their attack on Israel on October 7th last year, precipitating the war in Gaza, Iraqi Shi'ite armed factions, like other pro-Iranian groups, pledged to carry out attacks in solidarity with the Palestinians. They initially targeted mainly US forces based in Iraq and Syria, but on November 2nd they claimed their first ever attack on Israel. The number of attacks shot up to 17 in March and doubled again in May, averaging more than one a day. Israeli authorities have publicly confirmed at least 2 impacts on the coastal city of Eilat that Israeli media said came from Iraq, on a school in November and a naval base in April. Eilat has also come under repeated missile and drone attacks from the Houthi movement in Yemen during Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza. As Israel and Hamas make up their minds about a US proposed 3-phase ceasefire plan pertaining to the war in Gaza, observers hope that a truce deal could stall further attacks.